Absolutely. Welcome, everyone. It is Wednesday, May 5th. Happy Cinco de Mayo, everyone. It is Direct Line with Mark Uncover and Don Irvine and our special guest, Myron Ebell of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Take it away, Mark.
Well, thank you, Dwight, and welcome to the show, both Myron and Don. We're going to be talking about climate change. It used to be known as global warming, and we have really somebody who has carved out a real expertise in cutting through a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the hyperbole that is associated with this particular issue. Myron, let me ask you, kind of to kick things off, a provocative question. The name that you sometimes get called is a climate change denier. So how do you plead and how do you respond to that?
Well, this denier language came about as the attempt by look, everything on the left, if they can't beat you on the facts or the arguments, they try to destroy you personally. And so the denier label came, it evokes Holocaust denier, and
Right.
intentionally. And of course, it's very insulting to very famous climate scientists who happen to be Jewish, whose parents happened to get out of Germany and avoided the Holocaust, but still lost huge numbers of their families. People like Dick Lindzen, for example. So it's meant to be. It's meant to attack you personally because if you can't win on the facts or the arguments, you try to demonize the opposition. Of course, the funny thing about the denier label is it used to mean people who denied that there was any global warming going on, and for a number of years there wasn't any global warming going on. But now it's even people who agree with all the premises, but don't agree, for example, with the idea that we have to turn our economy upside down to save the world, and say, hey, look, aren't these policies a little too expensive? Aren't they actually more expensive than the alleged problem? They're deniers too. So so the denier universe keeps getting bigger and bigger, and pretty soon will be a majority, I assume.
That's a good. You touched on kind of one of the key divides in this whole issue, which is is there climate change? Is there global warming? And there's a tendency to want to debate or discuss that topic as though the solutions, once you've agreed, therefore the solutions are a fait accompli. And actually, the solutions that are being proposed are extremely, I can't come up with the right verb. It's not really complex. It's really draconian, some of the changes that are being recommended.
Yes. To get to the end of the story before we even have talked about climate change, the policies that we're being asked to sacrifice for right now, even if the theory is correct, the payoff won't be for 50 or 100 years, but the costs will be immediate. So we're being asked to impoverish young people today so that their great-grandchildren or grandchildren might live in a very, very slightly cooler world. The idea that there's a breaking point between saving the climate and climate disaster is preposterous. People live in Washington, D.C., which is cold in the winter and hot in the summer, but they also live in Singapore, which is hot all the time and somehow survive. And the idea that if the world is on average a couple of degrees warmer, it's going to be a disaster is really just preposterous. So we're being asked to this kind of fantasy future, but we're being asked to make all the sacrifices in the next generation.
Well, why don't we go back, because we did talk about sort of what. So what is your response about global climate change, global warming? We acknowledge that there is some, but it is a question of degree. You want to address that?
Sure. The climate's always changing, and the changes in historical time, the last few thousand years, are fairly minor compared to the changes over geological ages. We're in an interglacial period, about 13,000 years into an interglacial period between ice ages. Ice ages in the last few million years have tended to last about 100,000 years, and the interglacial periods have tended to last 10 to 15,000 years. So we're pretty late into the interglacial. Well, what was the ice age like? Well, there was 2 miles of ice on top of Chicago. So life, if we look, the problem that the global warming alarmists have is that cooling is really scary, and a little bit of warming, or even quite a lot of warming, isn't very scary. So if we had some cooling, what happens? Well, growing seasons shorten. Particularly in the temperate zone, where the grain belt is, where the corn and wheat and rice belt is. If we have cooling and we lower the length of the growing season, shorten it, we're going to have a hard time, having enough to eat. So cooling is a real problem. And in the 1970s, a lot of scientists thought that we were entering a period of some cooling, and I think that's a real concern. I don't know what human beings can do about it, but it's a real concern. So now the argument is that some warming is somehow going to destroy us all. But in fact, what we see is there has been some warming since the 19th century. Some of it is almost undoubtedly due to human causes, and there are mainly two main human causes. One is land use changes. You can change regional and local climates by cutting all the forests and starting to grow crops, for example. That's one way. And the other is burning coal, oil, and natural gas. And the product of combustion is to create carbon dioxide. So at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there was about 270, 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is a naturally occurring trace gas necessary for life on Earth. We take in oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide, up to maybe 40,000 parts per million in our lungs. Plants take in carbon dioxide and use it for photosynthesis. In other words, plant life, it's absolutely necessary for life on Earth, because plants can't photosynthesize without carbon dioxide. So what's been the result of moving from 280 parts per million to 410 or 20 that we are now? Well, it's greening the Earth. The biosphere is getting greener. NASA satellite photography shows this. Everybody agrees. And crop yields continue to go up. Part of that is technology, better farming, new seeds, all that stuff. Part of it is just more carbon dioxide, which is a plant food, essentially, a plant fertilizer. So that's the result of what we've done in terms of the biosphere. And what have we done in terms of the climate? Well, the rate of warming is about 1.5 degrees per century. The models that the global warming alarmists rely on predict 2 to 3 times as much, and that's what drives the debate. The debate is really about between the facts, the data, and the modeling.
So one of the issues that has been a sort of a point of contention are the predictions that are made. Say, I think we think of Al Gore 20 plus years ago, of whether that, again, you talk that the sort of worst case scenarios that were being predicted. So there was, for example, the idea that the oceans were going to rise to a particular level. What I'm hearing is there's not been a lot of success in making successful short-term predictions on the part of the alarmists.
No, they make scary predictions because they want to drive policy. I don't even know Al Gore probably believes this stuff, but I think a lot of the scientists know that these are wild exaggerations. The sea level, there are all kinds of alleged impacts from global warming. More storms, more floods, more droughts, more hurricanes, more tornadoes. all that stuff. But the big one that they're really concentrating on is sea level rise.
Right.
So what is sea level rise? Well, in the 20th century, the sea levels rose about 8 inches. The current rate of sea level rise, after we've had all this increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, is you can take your pick. It's either about 8 inches or it's about 12 inches. There's two different ways of measuring sea level rise. One is the tidal gauges that in the oceans, and the other is satellite measurements. The satellite measurements are now showing about 12 inches, maybe even 14 inches per century. So that's the debate. Which one of those is right? It's very hard to measure sea level rise because the oceans are sloshing around because the Earth is turning and gravity from the planets and the sun and all that. So it's very hard to measure. And also there are two things going on. One is that as the oceans warm a little, water expands when it warms. It's unusual. So the volume of the oceans is becoming greater just because it's warmer. The other is the claim that some of the Antarctic or the Greenland or the glaciers are melting faster, so that they're contributing more water. But it's really funny. One thing people keep saying, "Oh, we're going to lose Florida." It's really low, it's flat, and it's sea level rise, so Florida will disappear. Well, it has very little to do with sea level rise. It has to do with the fact that since the end of the last ice age, North America, which had all this, the northern part of North America, let's just call it Canada. Canada had, several miles of ice sitting on it, and that depressed the land, and it raised the southern part, the Gulf Coast and Florida and Georgia and places like that. And so now that's switching back. The Canada is still springing back from the end of the last ice age, and that's pushing down Florida. So until the next ice age, Florida is going to continue to sink.
So what? I'm sorry. So what happens to Florida?
Well, there's not much we can do about it. I mean,
Yeah.
if the next ice age doesn't start for 2 or 3 or 4,000 years, most of Florida will be underwater. The same thing is happening in Great Britain. Scotland is still rebounding from the last ice age, and that's pushing southern England, particularly London, where all the people live, down. So if we don't enter the next ice age, London will become a lot like Venice. You'll have canals. So, well, I'm sorry, would you rather have the next ice age, or would you rather have canals in London? You've got a choice here.
Well, you've already set it up before that the ice age also has huge. This is what was talked about in the 70s, was the fear that we were going through a period of getting colder, and an ice age was going to start, would have catastrophic impact. Let me go back and just kind of raise. Sometimes the issue in the conversation is that we in the West, or we in the most developed countries, have enjoyed the benefits of technology, and that we've done that disproportionate to the rest of the world. So there's a, how shall I say, a kind of economic redistribution component to the arguments here, that somehow, not somehow, but that Americans, or the people in a developed country, ought to sacrifice so that people in the developing world can somehow be able to use resources to a greater degree. So there's this kind of neo-Marxist component to that. Am I missing something there? Or
yeah, I mean, there's you see this in the debate over the Green New Deal, right?
Right.
What is it about? Is it about climate, or is it about something else? And Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's former chief of staff, in an interview with the Washington Post, they were sitting in a coffee shop on Capitol Hill, and I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but it's easy to find on the internet. He said, "Well, you think about the Green New Deal as about climate, but those of us who invented the Green New Deal, we think of it as about transforming the entire economy, kind of thing." Well, So the debate now, if you look at what's going on with the Biden plan and what's going on in Congress, it's all climate change plus environmental equity plus whatever environmental equity is, or environmental justice, whatever that is. So it's a whole bunch of other things. With Biden, he thinks it's high-paying union jobs. I'm not, who knows what he's thinking. But so let's look at the world and the energy realities. The United States, up until 10 years ago, was the largest emitter in the world. The European Union, most of Europe, was the second largest. I think probably Russia was third. Maybe we have to go back 20 years. And what do you have today? Well, Chinese emissions are now larger than the United States and the European Union combined.
Right.
India's are now catching up with the European Union. And so what's going on here? We're having this redistribution of wealth because these countries, by using modern technology and modern energy, primarily from coal, oil, and natural gas, the three, bad fuels, the bad energy sources, they are starting to enjoy the benefits that modern industrial civilization has given us for a long time. So China's emissions are continue to grow. And how is that? Because they're supposedly, the good guys in this debate. Well, they are now using half the world's coal, and they are constructing new coal-fired power plants every year, a whole bunch of them, and we are closing a whole bunch of coal-fired power plants every year. So the idea that we're saving the world by closing coal-fired power plants or stop using oil and going to electric vehicles, when you don't look at the whole pie chart and see what's going on with the whole world, you're going to think, oh, we must be doing some good because we're raising the price of energy, we're using less coal and less oil and less natural gas. We must be doing some good. Yeah, but it's like playing whack-a-mole. We're going down, but China's going up, and India isn't far behind. So the equity argument, I think, can be made to cut both ways. On the one hand, well, we should sacrifice so that these other people who haven't had the advantages that we have can have them. On the other hand, it's modern technology. It's the technology developed in the West that is allowing poor people in poor countries to live better lives, and that's all based on abundant, affordable energy.
And that really is an important point, is that the quality of life that has been improved by having a more, energy intensive lifestyle has if you look just within the last century and a half, is the dramatic change that's taken place. That said, you touched on it, but it probably needs to be sort of highlighted, is the fact that the United States has reduced its CO2 emissions over the last decade and a half, obviously with what has continued to be a growing economy and growing population as well.
Yes, although my guess is that the economy would have grown a lot more if we hadn't constricted our cheapest energy sources and gone to more expensive energy sources.
Right.
And I think we're going to see this in the future if we go down this path with these energy rationing policies. California has electric rates that are at least 50% above the national average. And California is kind of blessed. There's a lot of people who live in places with a mild climate in California. You don't really need heating in Los Angeles. If you live on the coast side of the mountains in greater Los Angeles, you don't really need air conditioning. So you don't use a lot of electricity. But they're paying a lot for their electricity, and they're going to pay a lot more. And that if we pursue those policies throughout the country, we're going to have a very high priced electricity, but also we're going to have much less reliable electricity, because going from a plant that can run 90% of the time and that when you have to turn it off to do maintenance, like a coal-fired power plant, versus a windmill that runs about over the course of the year, it runs at 30% of its efficiency. And when the wind doesn't blow, it doesn't run at all. Or solar panels that, they're not going to be producing electricity at night, but they often don't produce much in the day when it's cloudy or raining or something. So, we're entering a world where we're going to have higher priced energy, and we're also going to start having unreliable power. We're going to have blackouts. And we're just on the edge of seeing that.
Well, we could go in a whole direction there. I mean, one of the challenges in this space is the fact that there are assumptions being made about battery technology and the environmental. I mean, without knowing what that technology is or having it really available, or more particularly, even knowing the environmental costs associated with whatever the ultimate battery technology is, because you can't, as you say, you can't have any of the reliability without it, and it's really, the technology doesn't exist now.
Yes, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, look, all this stuff works. The question is, how much does it cost, and what scale do you have to build it? Batteries. You can have batteries online, and if the power fails, the battery can come on. But typically, the battery can come on for a few seconds or a few minutes. A physicist friend of mine who used to teach in Connecticut, but he's retired out to his native Colorado, he did a back of the envelope calculation about the Texas blackout this winter. Texas lost power for 4 days, parts of it. And he looked at the shortfall in electricity, and he decided that the world's largest battery storage unit, which is proposed for Morro Bay, California, which is going to cost over $500 million, that to cover 1 day, not 1 day of the Texas blackout, not all 4 days, you would require 350 of these units. And then you have to assume that they're all fully charged at the time the blackout occurs, and that they all work properly. And so 350 times 500 million is $175 billion, and that just gets you 1 day. You need 4 days for the Texas blackout, and we may have longer blackouts than that. So the scope of the costs and the technology involved in the raw materials to build the batteries, the hard rock minerals, it's astonishing.
Yeah, Myron, these are all really good points here. There's so many things about what the alarmists and environmentalists are doing that just drive me up a wall. And, on the electricity front, I mean, you talked about California. California's already had a series of brownouts and things like that. They've gone through this. They have a problem there. We have President Biden, he's promised to cut back the emissions even further. But, and China's kind of like, hey, well, that's great. That's fine. We might do it around 2035. When you're trying to get to that, we might start. There's no promises, they're there that they'll actually come through with it. After all, they're the Chinese, for heaven's sakes. And all these electric cars. One of our buddies, well, we know several people, but one of our buddies in our club is a big Tesla proponent. And I think those things are fine. But I think there are limitations. I mean, you're talking about higher electricity costs as we go forward. How much more is it going to cost to operate an electric car? Exactly, all this push towards electric vehicles that all these auto manufacturers are going to, exactly how are we going to get all these charging stations? Where's all the electricity going to come from? And do people understand who don't own electric cars is that it's not like you just plug it in and spend 10 minutes and you're off like a gas station and you're fully charged. It takes a while to charge a car.
Yes. Well, and we've got a comment here, all have larger carbon footprints than a GMC Yukon. Well, that's debatable. It depends on where it was built and where the raw materials came from and what kind of energy was used. Look, right now, all of the solar panels being made in China, and China dominates the world market, they all come from Xinjiang province, and that's where the Uyghur slave labor camps are, the forced labor camps that the Chinese communists have built for the Uyghurs, and they have to work to build these solar panels. Well, Bloomberg just had a story in which they said Well, the reason China put the solar factories in this province is because they have so much cheap coal-fired power. So your solar panel is and your battery is being produced by coal-fired power. But of course, we could produce it with wind power and solar power, and then it would be have a lot lower carbon dioxide footprint. So look, the odd thing about all of these proposals that are being made by the Biden-Harris administration and the Green New Deal in the Congress say, well, we have to get rid of all of our coal-fired power plants and our natural gas plants and electrify. Everything has to come from renewables. And then they say, and on top of that, we have to get rid of all our gasoline and diesel-powered vehicles, and they're going to have to be electrified. So we're going to have to produce a lot more power than just the electric grid currently, just to run our houses and our factories and so on. So we're going to have to do all that. And then, 60% of the homes in this country are heated by natural gas furnaces. So we're going to have to get rid of those and put those on electricity. Well, we can't even figure out how to put renewables to run the entire grid. How are we going to run the entire grid when it needs 2 or 3 or 4 times as much power? It's insane. It's not going to happen. But even though it's not going to happen, okay, we can declare victory now. We can still waste trillions of dollars trying to do it.
Yeah, I just want to say too, I've had solar panels on my house for a while. Still when it was a deal with Solar City before Tesla, took it back under its wing. And, this area, there are sunny days and there are cloudy days. And so, it's nice, when it produces, a good amount of energy to offset the electricity costs from the local utility. But it never, the net effect still is that during the course of a year, I'm still going to need electricity from the grid itself. I cannot generate enough electricity from those solar panels where I live to power my house for the entire year. It's just not, it doesn't happen. And and also, if you're going to have an electric car, it's running on a different voltage, right? In terms of for charging things, you'll need like a Tesla Powerwall or some kind of. You'll have to install something else to do that for that. What's a 220 voltage amperage?
Yeah,
so
220, 240. Yeah.
Yeah. So are homeowners ready to take that into account as well?
Well, a lot of people in Montgomery County can afford to put in, spend $10,000 or $12,000 to upgrade their power supply. Look, a lot of people live in apartment blocks. Where are they going to charge their electric vehicle? Look, I think electric vehicles have a lot of promise, and I think they have a lot of advantages, but at least now they also have a lot of disadvantages for a lot of people, and that's why you find that the average buyer of a Tesla or another electric vehicle, first of all, they're higher income brackets. Second, they own several vehicles. And so this is the one that fills some need, but they don't own 2 or 3 EVs. They own 1 EV and 2 or 3 conventional vehicles. So what do they use the EV for? Well, it's a nice status symbol. It's virtue signaling. It's very it makes you feel good. But you might use it to just drive to work and back every day. But when you go off on the weekend, you go off to the Eastern Shore or West Virginia, you're not going to take your electric vehicle because it's going to run out of power, and you don't have time to get it. You don't have 6 hours or 10 hours to get it charged up, and there are fast charging stations, but people need to know that fast charging stations degrade your battery. So if you use the fast charging station all the time, your battery isn't going to last as long. So, there are trade-offs with electric vehicles, just like there are with gas and diesel and bicycles and, paddle wheels.
Let's go back to talk a little bit about natural gas, because that's been an important story in energy use for the last, since the fracking revolution took place. So much of the transition or the change that took place with the reduction in CO2 was a result from the United States, was a function, as I understand it, of the transition to cheap natural gas because of fracking and what have you. And it's been interesting that the environmentalists who are want to see a change and want to reduce CO2 or what have you, have also been so resistant to the use of natural gas, when one of the advantages of natural gas is it's cheaper, but it also facilitates that sort of on-demand electric generation capacity, because a gas-fired plant can be turned on at when the peak requirements do that. What are your thoughts about that resistance to natural gas as being one of a sort of even acknowledging it as a transition fuel?
Yes, well, if you go back to 15 years ago, the Natural Resources Defense Council and other big, these huge environmental pressure groups. By the way, all those groups are now over $100 million a year in budget, and I just like to point that out. CEI, which is a free market think tank that works on a variety of regulatory issues, is $7 million a year, and we're one of the bigger groups on this issue on our side. So the other side's got billions, and we've got a few millions. So I just like to point that out. But NRDC back in, say, 2005 was trumpeting natural gas as a transition fuel. But that was before the shale oil and gas revolution. And so what was happening was that North America was running out of natural gas and the price was going up. So what they thought was, well, if we can close the coal-fired power plants, which have cheap coal, and we can move to expensive natural gas as the transition, that will force the price of energy up and make some of the alternatives competitive. Well, what happened? Well, the greatest energy revolution since atomic and nuclear power plants in the 1950s, the greatest energy revolution since then is the shale revolution. What is that? Well, up until the shale revolution, all oil and gas was produced by drilling and finding pockets of it underneath impermeable layers of rock. And so there'd be a pool of oil down here, and the rock would be keeping the pool. But everybody knew, all the geologists knew, that the shale was full of saturated with oil and gas. But how do you get it out? Because it's in the rock. Well, the government didn't figure it out. A private company, George Mitchell in Texas, the son of Greek immigrants, tinkered for decades, and he had some help from some other people like Chris Wright, who had some technical expertise. But he figured out how to drill down and then use horizontal drilling, and then this thing called hydraulic fracturing, which was invented by a tiny little company called Halliburton in 1949. And it's been used millions of times. And he combined those two things, and he figured out how to get oil and gas out of the rock. And that means we have hundreds of years of supply of natural gas. It's the cheapest fuel we have. And that's why the environmentalists hate it, because nothing can compete with it. So this is the world that the free market has created, not the government planners.
And just to belabor the point, it produces less CO2 relative to energy than coal, so that's allowed for a transition from coal and a reduction. Again, the objective that they had a decade and a half ago.
That's right. Yeah. If you look at the three hydrocarbon fuels, coal is the most carbon intensive, then petroleum, and then natural gas. So yes, natural gas produces about half the amount of CO. I mean, roughly CO2 as burning the same amount of coal.
So one of the issues we've talked about, we've kind of drilled home, is the increase in costs that will result from this energy transition. You've touched on the issue that it really is problematic whether or not it's even feasible to have reliable electric power using the sources that are being suggested. So what's your prediction? I mean, when does this hit the wall? How do you see all this playing out?
Well, I thought reality would sort of take over before now, but there are a lot of, you have a huge ideological or religious component of people who believe in the global warming, worldview. And they're very powerful. But what's happened is that they have managed politically to create, through government subsidies and government mandates, a huge climate industrial complex. And these are the people who produce energy that can't make it in the marketplace unless government says so, either by subsidizing it or just command. So this huge climate industrial complex is very powerful, and they've kept the bandwagon going far beyond what the ideological people would be capable of doing. So if you look at every millennial movement over history, or apocalyptic movement, you'll see that usually they go along like this, and then they just go whoosh, and then choo. And but that hasn't happened in the global warming debate, and I think it's because there's so much economic power in the climate industrial complex pushing it forward. So reality keeps getting pushed off to the side, and people never seem to look. The whole debate is climate change more of a threat, or is climate policy more of a threat? Well, in my view, climate policy is more of a threat by about 100 times than climate change, but that's debatable. And that's where the debate is, what it's really about now.
And that's really a good way of framing it, is the consequences of the policy. I loved your comment about the industrial complex, because let me pick on our good friend Don a little bit. What frequently happens with alternatives is the comparison, the economic or the make or buy comparison is done with energy that's heavily subsidized, with either a tax policy or some kind of, requirement to buy back power at a particular rate or what have you. And as a result, there's kind of an effect in apples. There's not an apples to apples comparison. There's an apples to oranges comparison, which ends up getting adjusted. And then people run around and say, yeah, it paid for itself. And when you really examine it, of course, it's because there was a tax subsidy or some other, use subsidy that ended up making a substantial difference. But I guess what you're suggesting is that creates incentives to want to see that continued. You see that with deadlines. The policy is going to expire. You got to buy your stuff now, and of course, then the policy gets extended.
Yeah, no. Once a special interest is given a government handout, it becomes very difficult to ever get rid of it. And we see this with the ethanol program, which pays, which is not a subsidy; it's a mandate. So oil refiners who make gasoline and diesel fuel, they have to blend a certain amount of ethanol. So they have to buy it from ethanol refineries, which are essentially, distilleries. And that benefits the corn farmers in the Middle West. And, once that subsidy was established, it just seems impossible to get rid of it, even though not only do the free market groups like mine oppose it, but the environmental groups oppose it too. So they didn't originally, but they do now. But you just can't get rid of it because there's so much political power based on the economic power being given to the corn lobby. So you see this in every one. Never oppose every kind of subsidy or mandate to any special interest, because once it's established, it's very hard to get rid of it. Now people say, oh, we got to get rid of the oil subsidies. Well, the oil subsidies are trivial compared to the renewable energy subsidies and the electric vehicle subsidies. They're pennies on the dollar compared to the renewables. I'm against them too. We need to get rid of them. But you get a $7,500 tax credit for buying an electric vehicle, and then you say, well, only wealthy people buy electric vehicles, so they're the ones who are getting the benefit. I thought we were supposed to help poor people, not rich people.
We'll put Don on the spot and say, how much of a subsidy did he get?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I didn't lay out money for that. I did the deal where I'm basically renting,
right,
for 20 years, for which, in 20 years or how many more years I've got left, I'm like, so I'll own them theoretically, and then it's my nickel for maintenance and other things. I don't know what the useful life of a solar panel is, but I have a feeling that Piper's coming near soon.
It's about 20 years, yeah. Maximum.
Yeah. So basically, so that's what Solar City did, was that they basically did a 20-year lease and saying, you pay us $1, you now own them, and that's your problem.
Right.
So you'll have to tear it down. Well, anyway, I thought that was a great. But I wanted to come back with one last question. So will there be a pushback? What kind of, do you see some constituencies who's push back, or is this really just something consumers are going to end up, complaining about higher prices and the higher taxes as a result of that, and responding to that instead of the policy itself?
Well, time will tell. There's a lot of polling on this, and more people in this country and in other countries say that climate is if maybe not a crisis, but it's a serious problem that we need to do something about.
Right.
So in that sense, we're losing the debate. On the other side, though, if you start asking people, how much are you willing to spend to address this problem? The answer is often like $10 a month per family. So in California, people are already spending hundreds of dollars a month per family in terms of higher energy prices, and they haven't done much yet to reduce their, well, they've done quite a bit, but they haven't gotten anywhere near where they have to get to achieve their goals. So if people knew how much they're already spending in additional energy prices, and remember, it's not just, this is what happens when we try to do this. Your viewers don't know that I'm doing a laptop plus an iPhone to get sound on one and video on the other. People don't know that they're spending all this money already and they're not getting much out of it. So my feeling is we can win that debate if we can make people understand, first of all, the rate of global warming is modest, the impacts are mild, and the costs that you're being asked to pay are enormous.
And the potential payoff from what you're being asked or required to do is fairly limited. Well, that seems to be a great conclusion. We put up some great resources on the chat function. Certainly the materials that you've got at CEI. And I know I've noticed that you've been particularly busy since the Biden administration got started. Although you were active, we didn't get into it. You were on the transition team for the Trump EPA. But you've also now been very active commenting on the Biden proposals. So we look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been fun talking to you.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Don.
Great to see you, Myron.